Well, the DA and several other political parties from the opposition have recently signed an agreement, you'll recall, to work together with the aim of unseating the ANC from national government during next year's vote. But one only has to look at coalitions at metro level, for example, which have been chaotic, to say the least, in Tshwane, Johannesburg, and Ekurhuleni, that's just here in Gauteng, to see that coalition marriages aren't really all they cut out to be sometimes. For more on this, let's speak to Professor Jaap De Visser, who is Interim Research Chair in the multi-level government for the Dullah Omar Institute at the University of the Western Cape. A very good evening to you. Professor, grateful for your time. You've written on this topic before, and in fact what you talked about in terms of making coalitions a success are a set of legal measures and conventions. What might those look like, and is it even possible to get universal agreement on those given the state of our politics?
Good evening, Tamikile, and thanks for having me. So, now I do think we need to at least start the conversation about some general rules and conventions pertaining to coalitions, and perhaps a few legal changes. But those for me are not as important as establishing certain conventions and traditions almost as to how we approach coalitions. And I think what happened this week, for me, it's actually quite exciting. It's quite encouraging to see what happened there. Not so much because of the politics of it, that's not really my scene, but just seeing that we now have a coalition being built in a professional way, sort of the professionalization of coalition making, because you can't really expect a few politicians in a hotel lobby to cobble together a coalition agreement. You need a certain process for it. So what happened here is that an independent mediator was established, or was approached and was appointed, and in Professor Gumede they found an excellent mediator. The process was, of course, behind closed doors, but there was transparency, there was feedback afterwards. They've set, I think, a bit of a benchmark in terms of how one can go about negotiating a coalition. You don't have to do it alone. You can have a predictable, transparent process led by an independent mediator, and I think that's something that we can learn from and can take forward.
But there are already cracks beginning to show, for example, with the IFP. Its youth brigade is basically saying the wool was pulled over their eyes in terms of what this was going to be and how it's panned out. I'm paraphrasing here. And I wonder if the parties in this country would even have enough time, if 2024 is the goal, to do the sort of consulting that would be required to get all the rank and file on board and make sure that the mission is clear. Because even listening to Talk Radio last week, some of the voters were saying, well, hang on, if I voted DA, I did not sign up for the party to be paired with organization X because, quite frankly, ideologically, I don't agree with what they stand for, so why then are we even speaking to them?
I think that's the difficulty with a pre-election coalition. So that's quite a tricky thing, because a pre-election coalition, can work, but of course now those political parties have to go into an election campaign, and they're going to have to explain to the voters why the voters must vote for them and not for the other party. So the Freedom Front Plus is going to have to explain why voters must vote for them and not for the DA, because that's what campaigning is about. So they have to distinguish themselves. Yet they are now sort of joined at the hip with this coalition agreement, which can also be confusing for voters, as you pointed out. So a pre-election coalition pact is difficult because you are now hovering between nailing your colors to the mast, but also, painting yourself in a corner. So I think what's more important is that after the electoral outcome, after we have the elections outcome, and if it comes to pass that we do need coalitions, that then there is sufficient time and a sufficiently predictable and transparent process to put together a decent coalition agreement.
What about then reworking some of the calculations that we've been working with for the last 29 years? By that I mean around representation, electoral thresholds, etc. Because what the coalitions, especially at metro level, have exposed is that we're no longer in a scenario where because your party has 47%, shall we say, of the vote, you basically get to call the shots in trying to cobble together an arrangement.
Yeah, so this is, I think, where we arrive at maybe some of the legal changes that are perhaps necessary, and thresholds are obviously a bit of a red herring. They're a big, hot button issue, but I do think it's important we talk about it. At the moment, our threshold is almost non-existent. We have a very, very low threshold. So I've often called it an Oprah Winfrey system where everybody gets some. Now that's fantastic for the plurality of voices in the council and in the legislature, because everyone's voice is heard and it's a diversity of voices. On the other hand, particularly municipal councils, they are not just a gathering of, different voices. They're also bodies that must make decisions. Very regularly must make very hard, difficult decisions, administrative decisions sometimes. And for that, you need to have a level of efficiency in the council. And then I think it would make sense for us to consider introducing a threshold so that, for example, in the city of Johannesburg, where you now have currently more than 20 political parties, with a 1% threshold, you would reduce that to less than 10. And then making coalitions should be easier and decision-making should be easier. Of course, it's not something that the smaller parties would want, because it would mean that many of them would not make it into the legislature. But we need to weigh that up against the very serious fragmentation of politics and the consequences for service delivery ultimately that we now see, particularly in our metros.
How do we, Professor De Visser, insulate, and you've written about this, insulate government departments, municipalities from the multiple crises that could come from coalitions, ensure that even when there is a falling out among the parties, the wheels of government continue to turn unaffected?
Yes, I think this is one of the most important topics that we often overlook. I think we should actually focus less on trying to limit the room to maneuver for politicians in making or breaking coalitions, because, that's politics, that's democracy. I don't think we should focus too much on that. We should focus more on ensuring that when there is changes in coalitions, that it doesn't have to result in paralysis or mayhem in the administration. And I think we can make a few small changes to the legal framework. For example, remove this idea that the municipal manager must chair over the election of office bearers. I think that's just a bad idea. Surely we can come up with something else. That the municipal manager whose future hangs in the balance must now chair over the election of office bearers. Those are small changes that we can make, but a much more bigger discussion we need to have about the professionalization of our administration. Are our senior administrators sufficiently insulated legally, also in terms of their terms of employment, from the goings-on in politics? Because, we often talk about coalition negotiations taking very long in other countries, in Belgium and elsewhere. But what we don't then say is that while those coalition negotiations happen, government continues. The wheels of government continue to work. And that's what we need to work towards here in South Africa, because here, when there's coalition turmoil, the wheels of government grind to a halt. And that's what we need to look at very, very seriously.
Professor Jaap De Visser, good to speak to you.